Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Richard Wilson, who's Senior Vice President, Primary Focus Lead for Genetic Regulation at Astellas. And he is really a wealth of knowledge and experience in drug development more broadly, but in particular in gene therapy that we're going to talk about today. When I think of the kind of people that are developing gene therapies and at the cutting edge of this really exciting and challenging modality, Richard's one of the first people I think of. So thank you for joining us today and looking forward to a really interesting discussion.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction, Patrick. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Let's jump right into gene therapy. It is a hot topic today for a couple reasons. I think there are, on the one hand, some amazing transformative medicines that are helping patients in ways that were just unimaginable 10, 20 years ago. But it's also, because I think of that success, running into challenges as well. How do we scale it? How do we make it more safe? How do we bring this amazing technology into more patients? I'd love to just get your take on the field right now. What's exciting? What are the big challenges? And how do you think about gene therapy?
Thanks, Patrick. Yes, so much to say about that topic. I think you teed up the subject very well. I think we're seeing still really impressive clinical results. I think about what we've seen with SMA, what we've seen with sickle cell disease is that patients are living lives they had previously never expected to live. And yet we see so many headwinds in this space, be it commercial headwinds, trying to find how we can get new payment models to function and get agreement on those, how we can think about investing in this technology and bring it through. How do we solve for the potential for safety issues that crop up from time to time? There's a lot of questions that swirl. I think, to me, this is still an exciting time. In a way, it's a bit like investing in the stock market. Everyone says, well, the trick is to buy
Buy
low
low,
and
sell
sell
high.
high. So, that sounds great, and everyone can look around, nod, and say, yeah, no, buy low, sell high, got it, let's do that. But then when you're in a low, are you really feeling like buying at that
Yeah,
moment?
yeah.
It feels very contrarian,
Right.
and you have to kind of make the case for why does this make sense. So in a way, I think that's kind of where we are right now in the gene therapy space, and I think we can roll cell therapy in that too. There's a need to remember what can we know as being true right now, and I think that comes back to we're not just looking at preclinical results. We're seeing lives change. We have seen some products start to really make a headway and making difference globally. At the same time, we need that certain X factor that I think is true behind every innovation, every evolution in this field. We talked before about the journey of monoclonal antibodies. And I know we talked about it before. Tim Hunt and the team at Alliance for Regenerative Medicines put a really nice deck together on this, and how, like many innovations, they seem really crazy and far-fetched right up until the moment they become accepted. And that's how we're looking at AAV gene therapy right now, for instance. So I think that when we focus on the value, we think about we've learned more and more about how to design, how to make, and how to deliver these therapies to patients. To me, that starts to have the look and feel of that, reason to believe. Why should we think there's a long-term, shiny, rosy future here? And I think it's really driven by the value and the benefits we can deliver. I think the story that doesn't get told as much is, how it's the day-to-day, week-to-week work that's gone on inside of a variety of labs and a variety of organizations that maybe doesn't get as much press, but you integrate that over the months and years. And I think increasingly topics like how do we improve manufacturing quality? How do we get robust processes that are predictable? How do we reduce things like empty capsids? How do we bring down the costs of manufacturing? Those are starting to become more solved problems, I think. And we hear this in the conversations we have across different sponsors and across different companies. I think as well, you look at the evolution of gene therapies themselves, and I'm pleased to say I think Astellas has been a part of this. We're looking at not just what can you deliver with Gen 1 technology, where's the field going for the next round and around beyond that? I'm thinking about where we're going with, the future of engineered capsids, for instance. We know, I think, time and again that the way to really kind of evolve and grow here is to find ways to deliver payloads at lower viral loads in a more selective way just to the tissues that need them, reduce the amount that the liver sees, think about how do we have a less immunogenic, drug product. We're starting to see that happen, and that's not meant to downplay the very real challenges and some of the safety events and tragic events we've heard recently in the media. But I do believe that the field increasingly has better and better answers to those problems. So to me, to try and kind of bring it all together, I think we're in a buy low moment. What gives me the confidence and why I think in Astellas we're in this for the long haul is we see enough progress and we can see the roadmap ahead to say there's a pretty interesting future here if you have the stomach and the capital to see through the current period.
Yeah, well, I'd like to dive into some of those that, we've got a light at the end of the tunnel, but there's some things blocking it. You named the safety and deliverability, I guess, is a big one.
Mhm.
Commercialization is another. Are there any other big blockers, or are those the two ones that really stand out to you? Is if we can solve those two, then actually the value of this and the potential of the technology really shines through.
I think there's probably some underneath this as well. I mean, I think maybe a couple of things come to mind. One is trying to continue to focus on partnerships and shared lessons learned. What becomes apparent, and again, we see this through organizations like the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, where we as sponsors we can get together and have conversations around what we're seeing, what are we dealing with. Increasingly, I think we're in a space where we need to be able to share the lessons learned with one another. So, how do we think about what the right approach is to immunosuppression in a
Yeah.
clinical development of an IV delivered AAV gene therapy, for instance? There's lots of reasons why that can be customized, but I think there's a lot of ways we can think about, well, do we each as individual sponsors need to go back and reinvent this every time because it's proprietary? Maybe not. So I think trying to think about how do we share the most important lessons that maybe aren't really competitive. Non-competitive sharing needs to continue to grow. I think the other side, and maybe this tips a little bit more to commercial, but it's on the path to commercial, is how do we create the frameworks and incentive structures to make sure we can continue to deliver these to patients who need them. Within Astellas, we've taken a position that we think, as I know we've talked about before, Patrick, that over the long haul, the potential application of AAV gene therapy could be pretty broad.
Yeah.
Right now, when you look at the unmet medical need, the size of the opportunity we're looking to create, still working through and demonstrating safety of delivery, the payer landscape, so on and so forth. We're in a moment where rare disease is still very much in the crosshairs for this technology. And I think we need to continue to be able to deliver on rare disease to allow us to open up the pathway to the future. However, there are things that are challenging for being able to continue to deliver in rare disease. I was just on Capitol Hill this week with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, where we were trying to make the case for a couple of key legislative priorities that we know are really important to see through, such as renewing the priority review voucher, the rare pediatric disease designation that allows incentives to be created for otherwise very small commercial opportunity products. Similarly, how do we get Medicaid to a place where we can facilitate reimbursement across state lines? We know there's been cases in the past where kids in one state who can only receive treatment at a specialist treatment center in another state, they get caught in the red tape
Right.
of Medicaid rules and regulations that mean reimbursement across state lines is very hard to impossible. So I think it's continue to focus on working with the administration, working with, the key stakeholders in the environment to make sure we can really smooth the path so that all those clinical benefits that we talked about a moment ago can really be brought to as many patients as possible. So I think to me it's those two things. It's both forms of collaboration. One is across sponsors and academics and obviously patients, and the others with, regulators, payers, government, healthcare systems, so that getting an approval is not enough.
Yeah.
Success here is getting the value of these transformative treatments to as many patients who need them as possible.
Yeah, and on that front, I think the messages from the administration in the US have been pretty mixed, right? On one hand, you're hearing fewer regulations, fewer red tape,
Hmm.
enabling some of these things to proceed to patients faster, and obviously keeping safety in mind as well. But also there are, some of these persistent challenges that you're talking to. I'd love to get your perspective on optimism or pessimism on how that's going to evolve, or uncertainty. And I'd love to hear about Europe and other parts of the world as well. Astellas is a Japanese company. You have a
Hmm.
very unique, view. I think you're a Brit living in the US. I'm an American living in the UK. I'd love to get your perspective on globally. How is this evolving? Because the US is changing a lot, but so are other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment in time. And I think that also plays back into our earlier
Yeah.
conversation about, buying low. Part of that is also the uncertainty. We know markets in the broadest sense depend on stability and predictability, and that includes regulation, rule of law, so on and so forth. So I think that there are definitely points of light here that we need to be focusing on. Historically, I think it's fair to say the FDA has tended to lead the way. They've had some of the more forward-thinking approaches to how to regulate and facilitate these kind of medical breakthroughs. And I think that, it's not always been a straight line.
Yeah.
But certainly what we're hearing, through bodies like ARM and through other outreach through the new administration, as we think specifically about cell and gene therapy, I think there's been some reasonably good points of optimism here that we should be zeroing in on. I think specifically one key thing we've heard loud and clear, and we heard it again this week in the halls in Washington, people really understand that there's something very important about being able to develop treatments that target the root cause of disease.
Right.
And I think that this is a theme we're hearing time and again from the new administration in the US. We don't want to treat symptoms. We don't just want to, it's an inelegant term, like paper over the cracks of a disease. What we want to do is go in and fix the problem at its root cause. And there's no finer example of that than a genetic medicine that either goes in and delivers a, healthy copy of a gene, edits a gene, allows to put in, cells that can achieve some sort of regeneration. All of those things really have a fundamentally different approach to medicine. And that seems to be resonating throughout much of the US administration. I think as well, there's a key theme around collaboration again. We need to see that I think the path to success is perhaps more frequent and perhaps a little less formal interaction and collaboration with, say, FDA. And I think that we're seeing several examples of that as you look across the field where companies are coming to agreements around how to design novel clinical trials and reach BLA through perhaps what were traditionally seen as unusual pathways. So, we look back over the last few years and we had, uniQure's Huntington's program. Just recently, we saw Neurogene and Taysha both unveil pathways that look to be potential openings in Rett syndrome. The opportunity to continue to collaborate and find new ways, I believe, is still there.
Yeah. For people who aren't familiar, what are the novel approaches they're taking?
I think these are things that are basically like being able to rely on using external controls. So things
Yeah.
like leveraging natural history, that we don't necessarily need to always go and run, a placebo-controlled study, for instance. Why is that important? Oftentimes, running controlled studies can be challenging, or placebo-controlled studies, I should say, because we're dealing with rare diseases. So it's hard to enroll patients. Adding arms to your study adds time and
Yeah.
it adds costs. And we're at a moment in time where we actually have the luxury of neither of those things. I'll try and avoid getting too specific, and the avoidance of doubt. We do have a relationship with taste gene therapy, so I want to kind of
Yeah.
be a little bit respectful of that. But what we're seeing in Rett syndrome is an opportunity to redefine how do we look at efficacy. This whole concept of patients regaining milestones that they had previously lost through the course of
Yeah.
a previously irreversible disease. And, I think that thinking about what does a future development plan look like in, say, rare neurodevelopmental diseases, we're able to now ask new questions because of the kinds of therapies that are being developed. And I think we're going to see that more and more in different treatments. I will say to your earlier point, Europe is in an interesting place right now. We know there's a desire from EMA to think about how to be a little more agile and adaptable. We know in the European Union, the Biotech Act is something that's starting to get more and more traction. This idea that, Europe wants to find a way to ensure they can maintain competitiveness in a global stage. And so EMA, I think, is in a place where they actually want to listen. I think they're still paying close attention to what's happening at the FDA and under Marty McCarry's leadership. So I think the opportunity in Europe is still evolving. The other side of that, obviously, is looking at things such as reimbursement landscape, which gets really quite complex in such a bloc as the European Union. The recent panels that were convened around providing joint clinical advice for health technology assessments is a good case in point, where, the topic we were just talking about in the context of gene therapies, the ability to use single arm studies paired with natural history, that's not universally accepted in all regions. And I think that's been a big lobbying point to try and say, we need to try and get fit for purpose HTAs where we can demonstrate an unambiguous benefit. The reason being, there's 450 million people in Europe. If you want to provide those who are suffering with these, typically, devastating conditions which have very few options, if we create different degrees of standards in the US and Europe, ultimately that's going to disadvantage the citizens and patients in Europe. I think Japan is also trying to learn. There's a joint meeting that we have every year between ARM and FIRM, which is a kind of Japanese counterpart. And we talk a lot about in those meetings the need to think about how can Japan leverage the amazing scientific base and really learn lessons from the US ecosystem around scaling entrepreneurship, whether that's thinking about investment, it's about creating regulatory pathways, it's about making connections between large and small companies and large companies and academic institutions. So I think there's a strong desire to think about how to both grow the homegrown system in Japan and also address this topic of drug lag that's been raised before, where there's a concern that companies don't necessarily bring their products to Japan for approval and reimbursement, and that creates a disadvantage for the Japanese population.
Why is
With,
that?
I think it's complicated by a few factors. I think it's a perception of the complexity of the Japanese system. Sometimes there have been requirements for things like running a separate clinical trial in that's has Japanese patients enrolled in it as a prerequisite for any approval by PMDA. It's the fact that, in Europe, you can still do business in English, and in Japan, you have to have a lot more of boots on the ground approach to navigate PMDA and the other authorities that are required to get access and approvals. Realistically, though, I think it's trying to say, hey, we're open for business in Japan. So I do think, to your point, companies like Astellas, where we do have a footprint and we do have those boots on the ground, should have an ability to be part of a leading edge of driving through those kinds of new modalities. So I think the situation globally is different depending on region, and we haven't even touched on, how are we getting into Latin America
Yeah.
or the Middle East, where there's also very different and creative approaches to think about how do we address these large unmet medical needs. So collectively, this is both the opportunity and the challenge for us. How do we get a cohesive approach that allows us to bring these amazing potential medicines to market, treat as many patients as possible with such a diverse world? So, yeah, there's a lot going on.
Which therapy areas are you most positive on in the near term?
I would say, there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, maybe kind of building on some earlier themes. I think we're seeing a real, almost a renaissance of in the neuroscience area. We talked about Rett syndrome, Huntington's disease. We're seeing some amazing results in Parkinson's recently. We've partnered with Aviado Bio on a genetic cause of frontotemporal dementia. There's a lot of excitement in the field about really moving forward and starting to see some green shoots of clinical data across multiple previously intractable diseases where we think being able to deliver a genetic payload can make a real difference. What I think is exciting is the more trials get run, the more we start to see those early signs of clinical efficacy, the more we get agreement with regulators that there's a path to approval, then the more investment we'll see.
Yeah.
The technology changes that we are seeing are really starting to yield. So I think we're really starting to understand how to deliver AAV to the central nervous system. We know there are multiple different paths you can take, whether those are direct delivery, such as intrathecal, ICV, or, we signed an agreement last year with Sangamo to leverage their IV delivered CNS penetrant capsids. There's just an increasing number of ways that we can see to get these genetic medicines to where they need to be. And, there's some really interesting breakthroughs coming through with companies looking to address tumors and cancers in CNS, such as glioblastoma.
Oh, interesting.
So, I think that we may be on the breakthrough of a range of different diseases yielding to this modality, because over those weeks, months, years, we're starting to learn how to use these tools.
Yeah. And what's hard now on the other side of the spectrum? What's really hard, and we have some work to do before we can get there.
Oh boy, that is a good question. I think I should maybe flag my early comments to say I see these as doable, but that's not the same as saying they're easy.
Yeah.
I think there's still plenty of hard even in those doable areas. So that's things like trying to come up with an agile fit for purpose clinical development plan. I mean, like I've skipped for all our research colleagues, I skipped completely over, vector design,
Right. We're
scalability,
going to come back to that for
preclinical
sure.
models, But, I think about how do we go from the preclinical phase to registration? The need to make that as compact and telescoped and as efficient as possible is still really difficult.
Yeah.
You can be looking at a disease state where there may not be a precedented path to follow. So you're going to have to come up with some endpoints or make some educated guesses. You're going to have to work with your colleagues in market access and reimbursement from the stage of filing that IND to say, are we asking the right questions now that in 6 years' time is going to
Right.
form the basis of a dossier you're going to submit as part of an HEA? And there's going to be a few people who probably fell off the chairs when I said 6 years, but just picking a number for
Yes.
argument's sake. And I think it's understanding that one of the unique things about this field is a one-time treatment. You deliver it one time, then that means the very early clinical patients that you dose really define both the longevity and the long-term benefits that you hope will form the justification of your value statement. So that puts even more emphasis on those very first patients getting those early clinical trials just so. We can't take let's dip a toe in the water. Let's prove, safety and maybe a little bit of, biomarker encouragement, and then we'll revisit what does development look like. We're going to have to start very much with the end in mind in this whole field. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity and a challenge all in one.
What is the most common challenge that you see in that process? Because you've run a few of these many, many years in, and I see exactly the same things you're talking about. It's questions that may seem simple, but you can end up in these loops. Like, do we treat the most sick
Mhm.
patients or patients who are sick to an intermediate level, they have profound implications on how much you can see in a certain period of time, how much you may exacerbate underlying comorbidities and
Hmm.
cause safety issues. Some of these, like, you can pose these simple questions that just become really difficult to map out and say, where are we going to land 6 years in the future? And vector is another example, right? You choose some trade-off between deliverability and scale and cost of goods, and then the technology changes, and do you revisit that and and take a few steps back? What are the big ones that you've seen firsthand are really important to get right?
Two things, I think. One to endpoint selection, I think is key. And I think time and again, even in for genetic medicines targeting a disease where there's existing therapy, we often find those endpoints just aren't necessarily fit for purpose. A good example is the very familiar 6-minute walk test that's used
Yeah.
in DMD, where we're employing it in Pompe disease. We're seeing it in a range in like neuromuscular conditions. And everyone starts there because it's a validated endpoint. We know what it means, and yet, we talk to patients a lot. We hear from patients who are considering being part of our trials how and the clinicians who are operating these tests. These are very imperfect tools. A 6-minute walk test can be influenced by things like, do the patients who are being measured have to walk on carpet or linoleum or concrete? Do they
Right.
have to go over steps? Do they wear a pair of sneakers or a pair of formal shoes? Did they sleep well the night before?
Yeah.
There's all these things that, well, we've got these imperfect tools, but at some point we have to break from the herd and develop new things. So I think trying to work out how do we bring new endpoints and new markers, wearables, for instance, into clinical trials from the beginning is something I think we really need to start seeing more of. To kind of give a nod to vector design, I do think that, now, especially for programs that are just getting started, really thinking about where are we going to place our bets for next gen therapies is really key. So that's really kind of thinking about, are you going to go with a local delivery approach, or are you going to go with a systemic delivery? How do we understand the pros and cons of each of those things? I think we can debate things like biodistribution in the CNS, for instance. We know that for good and bad reasons, the only species that ultimately is really going to be predictive is humans.
Yeah.
So, I think that collectively trying to work out how do we find the best viral vector to get the best distribution is really important. And also understanding whether we're operating diseases that need a lot of protein. DMD is obviously one that comes to mind with dystrophin, versus diseases where a little may go a long way. And maybe the little goes a long way are more forgiving for
Yeah.
maybe you don't have quite as much of a confident biodistribution, for instance. So I think that, to me, vector choice is really critical. And then hand in hand in that was obviously regulation of expression. And I think we're starting to see some really interesting work come out in terms of ways that we can creatively either regulate or turn on and turn off gene expression depending upon the disease state, disease setting. So what I hope is that we will find ways to make those a little bit less of a barrier to entry. I think back to FDA, if we start to kind of continue to build on these concepts that seem to be baked into the platform idea, can we start to leverage one another's INDs if we're using the same viral vector? Several sponsors, we've been in some of these discussions, are starting to have those discussions now. How do we make it easier? If we make a choice and we say that we've got a great therapy, if only we could have started 2 years ago with
Yeah.
capsid X instead of capsid Y, how do we make that easier to switch? And I think that that's going to be a really key question as we think about one of the liabilities I think we see is that we get locked in. You're into the clinic already and you learn something critical and you say, like, we'd love to go back and fix some aspect of the vector. And we got to make it so you don't have to pay a 3 to 4 year penalty to
Yeah.
maybe come up with a better product.
Yeah. Do you have to go back and do a new IND these days? So start from scratch, or how does that work if you need to make like a significant
Mhm.
change to the vector?
I think so. I mean, it's basically starting
Yeah.
a whole new program. So, I think we've seen several cases of that in the past where, companies were pushing full ahead, ran into a problem. Maybe it was an immunogenicity problem. They wanted to switch a capsid, or they had an issue with payload. I think there was an example in the consortium that got together around DMD gene therapy developers a few years ago, where they'd identified that certain patients in DMD had deletions that corresponded to parts of the transgene in some of those gene therapies, which increased the risk of an immune response to the transgene and the protein. So those sorts of things, you can go, aha, we've found a solution. The price you have to pay to go and fix that is still very high.
Yeah.
So I think we need to think about what's the amount of preclinical work we need to do to get us back into the clinic. If you want to take that move and re-engineer, what's the right amount of preclinical in vivo work that needs to be done? Do we need to redo yet another biodistribution study of AAV9, for instance? Probably the world knows enough about that now. It's trying to be a little more sophisticated rather than say, like, right, go back to square one, start over, build the whole case from scratch. So I do think that's going to happen, but that's going to be imperative to make things easier for the whole business, the whole
Yeah,
sector.
definitely. Let's talk about manufacturing a little bit, because I think
Mm.
you all have made pretty significant investments in that whole part of the technology stack. And it was one of the things that my eyes were open when I started to learn more and
Mm.
and participate more in the gene therapy ecosystem, of just how much that comes up and how similar to vector design, it can set you back many years if you make mistakes. And it's such a critical part of the process from a quality perspective. So if you could give people a sense of, like, what is it what does it look like today, like even literally the size and scale of the reactors that we're talking about, and also where this might be going in the future as well. And I'm from North Carolina, where I think you have some footprint there. Lots of people have
Yeah.
big bioreactors there where they're making gene therapy. So I'd love if you could just open people's eyes to that world a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'll try and do justice to the work of just a lot of people. I mean, I think it's interesting because it's typically been a very secretive part of the business, because so much of the IP and trade secrets are tied up with how exactly you're approaching manufacturing. Appropriately so. But I'll say, within Astellas, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I think firstly, what have we done internally? As you know, we built out, staffed our own greenfield manufacturing site in Sanford, North Carolina. That's where all of our gene therapies are now made for the clinic, and ultimately that's going to be our commercial site. That partners extensively with a really, really strong process development team that's based out of South San Francisco. So to me, it's having both that ability to think about how do we scale and how do we develop the right process from the beginning. We've said publicly before, we use HEK 293, standard kind of processes, but we found ways where we've layered on a variety of different approaches to that platform that we think has given us some of the class leading productivity compared to, certainly other companies we talk about. We often, through the course of business development, we'll talk a little bit about manufacturing with other companies, and we feel really strongly about the kinds of productivity and quality that we're seeing out of a Astellas facility in North Carolina. To get to the key questions that you were asking, I think that like a lot of companies, we were thinking about this 5, 6 years ago. This was very much in the heyday of, like, the, call it Gen 1 gene therapy explosion, where everyone was using natural serotypes. We were probably, quite some ways away from reactor productivity than we are today. So, back then, everyone was looking at, all right, how many 2,000 liter reactors do you have? And, that's your badge of pride. Look how built out our facility is. And while, yeah, we absolutely have that 2,000 liter capability, we can scale to large batch sizes. All the things we were talking about earlier on have actually started to push us in a slightly different direction, where, as you look at the process itself, if you can make more viral particles per mil, the same number of doses need less volume to make. So we can start to either make less batches or make like the same number of smaller batches to deliver the same market need. At the same time as we're coming up with novel engineered capsids or we're doing more local delivery, those make log order differences to the
Right.
amount of viral vector you need. So the good news is that we're actually starting to get much more efficient as we think about how much material do you need to make in a bulk sense to deliver to how many patients. If we're improving efficiency, if we're having to deliver less viruses per patient, and we're doing it in a much more tailored way, I think it's safe to say, we're hearing less people sort of get on calls and talk about how many 2,000 liter reactors they
Right.
have. And it's much more about, you know, scalability, reproducibility, product quality, where we're at right now. We're really very happy with the reproducible product quality. We've made gene therapies in a range of different serotypes. We've got very good levels of full capsids, not just reducing empties, but also partial capsids, and doing it in a way that's cost efficient. So I'll have to dance a little bit around how much I can say on a
You've reached the
podcast, but
frontier of my knowledge as well. So I this has been useful enough for me. We talked a lot about AAV, and it
Mhm.
is the workhorse of the industry for a reason. Are there other delivery methods that are interesting to you as well? I'm curious to learn about that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a sector we tend to get pretty tribal.
Yeah.
You're either an AAV person or an mRNA LNP person, or you're a lentiviral, you name it. And I think that the reality will be there's just going to be a home for everything. So we do have some work ongoing within Astellas. We haven't talked about much of it publicly, but we do have some NRA and LNP work, for instance. And knowing that, there's some really amazing steps that have been taken at that technology. And at the same time, it's not yet at the point where it's quite as versatile at transducing different tissues as AAV can be.
Yeah.
But for delivery to the liver, for instance, it's a very attractive modality. At the same time, I think we've seen some really interesting progress with viral vectors that are not AAV at all. Try not to endorse any particular company or organization, but we're aware of work that companies like Carbon and Ring are doing,
Yeah.
where they're looking at radically different viruses, and those can have a range of benefits. From You're no longer capped by the size of the payload. We know that really about 5 kilobase is about the max end of where you can go with AAV. But there are other viral vectors that can dramatically expand that, even HSV, as we see with Crystal Biotech and going after DEB. You can get larger payloads in there. So, what diseases suddenly become tractable? They have a different immunogenicity profile, or a different pre-existing immunity risk. So does that mean for patients who might be ineligible for AAV, there's an opportunity to help those patients with another viral vector? Or can you redose? Can you bring back on top of, someone who's previously received an AAV with a top up, or a top over kind of dose, where you say, like, we can now achieve things that weren't envisaged with Gen 1. Why am I still talking about AAV and viral vectors? I mean, I think, the big reason why it's persisted is it's still just incredibly efficient at delivering genetic material into the nucleus of cells. I think we spent years and years trying to wrangle how to do that effectively. And, for all of the wrinkles and bumps in the road, there's still no denying that AAV does that really well.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think we have to pay attention to and be, awed by things such as, the baby KJ story that came out recently, with
Yes.
the ability to design a custom CRISPR N of one therapy. I mean, that if that doesn't stop you in your tracks and make you think like, huh, what if? How do you scale that? What could you do there? To me, that's where I think we need to get out of our tribes and think, back to that collaboration thing. Where do we find the right tools, the right expertise, the right pathways, where bringing the patient back to the center of all of this, we know how to pull the right levers and adjust the right dials to get the best therapies.
Yeah. Speaking of collaboration, there's something I wanted to finish on that really caught my eye, which was an announcement you made a couple months ago that you're going on the Timmerman Traverse, which, for people who aren't familiar, Luke Timmerman he's a founder of the Timmerman Report. He's a journalist and really an exceptional one that's covered biotech and genomics and life sciences for a long time. But he leads this really interesting multi-day hike every year, and people who join, I think, commit to raise money, and you're going to raise $1 million collectively for some really important causes. I would just love to hear. I think it's in a couple of weeks now, right? We're recording at end of July and it's mid-August. How did that come about? Have you done it before? Maybe you could just tell people a little about why you chose to do it.
No, thanks, Patrick. I mean, you're right. It's all Luke Timmerman's brainchild, and Luke's an uber connected person in the sector. So, he tries to think about who can he recruit to his fundraising mission. And to be clear, the hikes and the climbs are all really fascinating, great opportunities to kind of be in nature with like-minded people. But the real mission here is to help others. So this particular hike is in support of Life Science Cares, which is a phenomenal organization that's focused on really trying to think about how do we give back in the communities where biotech has grown and thrived. So that's really addressing poverty, inequality, going from the basics like food and shelter to vocational training, mentorship, so internships, just a whole range of opportunities. So Luke has both the network reach and a great way of getting people to say yes
Yeah.
to embark on these outdoor adventures. There's going to be a little over 20 of us, biotech leaders and investors, coming together. As you noted, we've all committed to raise at least $35,000 towards this grand total of $1 million. We're actually right knocking on the door of $1 million
Yeah,
right
you're
now, which
almost
is
there. I
amazing.
was looking at it earlier
Um,
today.
so, it's really gratifying to see how people want to join in and give back. I'll say, I mean, we're also thinking about, all right, we got to spend a couple of days hiking. I mean, I, I love the idea of where we're going in the Cascades for a couple of days. Luke did ask me if I'd do Kilimanjaro a year or so back, and I was like, literally had a conflict or something. But training for the Cascades doesn't feel quite as daunting. But we're going out there trying to think, how do we get together as groups here and start to put in 10 miles at a time and
Yeah.
get some real elevation and see if our hiking boots still fit, and how are our legs going to deal with this back to back. But Luke's a great fundraiser. He's a great rallier of the troops. And, again, I think he would be right here championing, saying, like, this is all about life science cares. And, especially at this moment, there's so many challenges in the country and in the world. If we can kind of take a little bit of our place of privilege and really do something that helps others, that's kind of why we're all in this business anyway. So thanks for the opportunity to give a plug, Patrick.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, and we'll put the link in the show notes in case people want to support. I think it's amazing, and it is a really great way to connect with people. It's something about walking side by side, the
Yeah.
rhythm, the outdoors, that you have conversations on those kind of things that you just don't have anywhere else. And to combine that with raising $1 million is, it's clear that he's on a mission here to help people, because he could organize this and raise no money, right? And it wouldn't be a problem. But I think it's an amazing thing.
100%. And I should say, I mean, Luke's a phenomenal journalist, as people no doubt have read his work and listened to the Long Run podcast as well. But he's no mean fundraiser, I can tell you. He takes no prisoners, So, I would encourage anyone who's intrigued about participating. It's a really fun experience, but also, it's a very serious fundraising enterprise here. So, excited to get to the finish line and also to get on the hike with Luke and the team.
Absolutely. As we wrap here, Richard, is there any parting thoughts you want to leave with people, or is there anything that the audience can help you with? You're hiring, you're looking for partners, anything like that? I would love to hear from you.
I appreciate the chance. I mean, I think one thing we haven't touched on, which I think is absolutely critical, is these are difficult times. We've talked a bit about that. Both from the science, from the field, candidly, politically, culturally, socially. It's a tough time, and I think at moments like this, it's very hard to think about, how do you find the mission and the vision, and why are we still, to use the hiking metaphor, just keeping putting one foot in front of the other. And I think it's really encouraging us all to focus back on patients and the unmet medical need. I think Everyone who gets into this business does so because we have a passion, not just for science, but for trying to make a difference, to really try and help people who really, through no fault of their own, have ended up on, the tough end of life's lottery with genetic diseases and conditions. And so to me, I'd say loud and clear, if we can all focus on doing what's right for the patients, if we can really think about keeping them in mind, listening to patients, how are we developing our treatments to best serve them? How are we designing our clinical trials and creating endpoints to best meet their needs? How do we take inspiration from the courage they have to bring every day without any choice to take the right kinds of risks we need to take to develop these therapies and get them across the line? That to me is what it all comes down to. I'm always interested to hear from folks who want to collaborate. We do feel very strongly about partnering, collaborating in Astellas. So please think of us, reach out to me, reach out to others at Astellas. We believe strongly that no one company, no one person is going to solve all the world's problems, only through coming together and partnering. We're going to be able to deliver on the promise for the patients to count.
Yeah, amazing. I think that's exactly the right note to end on. So, Richard, thank you for all your time and also for all the great work you're doing to push gene therapies forward. I am right there with you. It's now is the time to buy low, and I think the science is exciting. I think the unmet need is there. The value is clearly there. We have to push through some of these challenges, and I think you've done an amazing job articulating that. So, thanks for spending time with us today.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Me as well. And thanks everybody for joining us. As always, we'll see you next time. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Cynogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit cynogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible, in particular Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.